Okay, well, good morning. I've now been in the Australian superannuation system since 1986, when I established what is now a very large profit per member fund. Did the mandatory contribution legislation as a senator, and the SIS Act, we call it, Superannuation Industry Supervision, Trustee Oversight, etc.
Nick, would you use the microphone?
Put it on here. Okay. And since I retired, or a minister for superannuation, assistant finance minister, and then in retiring, I've been doing a lot of work in many different aspects of the retirement income systems in a lot of countries. One broad observation, and it was touched on earlier in the great presentations, my broad view is that Australia and New Zealand comparatively have less challenges than most other advanced economies. One of my post-retirement projects was to work with EY on the Greek pension system 5 years ago. You know, and if we think we've got challenges, go to a country like Greece or Japan, or even China now, because of the demographics. Australia and New Zealand in comparatively good shape, but they've got, so long as they make policy adjustments in the areas that were talked about earlier, I think they will continue to be in good shape. Why is Australia relevant to New Zealand in the context of superannuation? Well, firstly, we're the only two countries that actually share that name, would you believe? Superannuation. We're the only two that use it. Secondly, closely integrated economies. Thirdly, and I think really importantly in the context of KiwiSaver, the providers that were found by the Royal Commission and the Productivity Commission to be poor performing, higher fee and bad behaviour are the providers in Australia that are dominant in New Zealand. They are dominant in New Zealand. Now, I'm not saying the same bad practices exist in New Zealand as existed in Australia. The regulator can look at the evidence, but that is, I think, an obvious question to ask. And then I think when I was minister, I signed off on portability, transfers of KiwiSaver super from one country to another, except on self-managed super funds. I refused to allow that transfer from New Zealand into self-managed in Australia. So we've got portability between the two systems when we've got a labour market portability. So Australia is very relevant. Just a quick overview. The systems are quite different. The start dates, obviously, Australia was a very early starter. By the way, Australia's done a lot of good things, but it's got a lot of things wrong as well. I'm the first to admit that. We were an early mover, 87, one of the first countries in the world to shift very significantly from the old DB system to a mandatory DC system, no opt-out. And my only excuse for the mistakes we made in Australia was we were an early mover and we made a lot of mistakes that we're still trying to fix. Contributions. Australia obviously has had a lot higher contributions for a longer period of time. Look at the percentage of GDP. 140% of GDP, the Australian system today. It is the fourth largest system in the world with a population of 26 million. It's overwhelmingly defined contribution. It's now 90% defined contribution. Interestingly, I mean, obviously New Zealand's a lot smaller, but what I did note was that New Zealand is now starting to grow very rapidly. KiwiSaver, it's the power of compound return on compound return. So KiwiSaver is starting to develop some scale. Contribution mechanisms, Australia is direct to the fund, and there are a lot of funds in Australia, whereas New Zealand has a central platform. Very, very different and very significant implications. Governance, the one area I want to touch on is trustee governance in Australia. Has massive implications for our system in terms of the provider, whether they are a not-for-profit or the retail provider, acting in the interests of the members. That is the law in Australia. And one of the fundamental issues to come out of Hayne just didn't look at banks. He looked at the bank-owned superannuation entities. He looked at AMP, he looked at IOOF, commercial not-for-profits, whether bank or not banked. And Haynes said to those institutions, commercial not-for-profits, you are breaking the law. You are not applying trustee law. You are not acting in the best interests of your members who are in a mandatory system in your funds. You are acting in your commercial best interest. That has profound implications going forward. There's a secret, there is as yet unreleased prosecutions file of trustees in Australia who will have to face the courts, and they are all in the retail sector. What is really interesting is the profit for member, not-for-profit sector, had none of that critique, because it's, as trustee overlay, it's always been focused on the member, overwhelmingly. That has really important implications, a trustee overlay. Default in Australia, you default into a fund, then you may opt out of that fund and select an alternative fund, individual choice. You defaulted first, then you move out if you wish. Invariably in Australia, you are advised to move out. And you'll notice the parentheses around advised. In Australia, planners who advise, and accountants I might say, in the self-managed super sector, have a series of conflicts. And Australia is about managing those conflicts. They're owned by retail providers in the main. There are a significant and growing independent, genuinely independent planner sector. Default investment option, New Zealand provider determined. I understand the FMA have some oversight of that. In Australia, it was generally provider determined, the default investment option, but we've had the imposition of MySuper, which is creating a benchmark standard across the system in terms of where the monies are invested and, critically, the return after fees. And a couple of other quick differences. You've got early access. You've got access to first home, which is we don't have in Australia, except they've just introduced voluntary contributions access for first home in Australia. There's a big political debate about that. And retirement. I mean, there's supposed to be a retirement income system in both countries. Now, Australia's done very poorly in designing the post-retirement. We've been in this for 30 years, and it's still semi-developed. The final issue point I'd make is New Zealand is KiwiSaver is very simple. Australia is very complicated. It's the most complicated defined contribution system in the world. It's got so many features. It's got contributions type, we've got insurance, we've got estate provisions, transition to retirement. Then you add on top of that our means testing of the state pension. And one of the little analysed issues is what is the admin cost of running such a complex system? And the fees on admin vary between 20 to 40 basis points per account in Australia. That is very high because of the complexity of the system. So the reality is if you have a complex system, it is very expensive. In New Zealand, you don't have that characteristic. I just did a comparison, the number of providers, New Zealand, Australia. The New Zealand number, KiwiSaver, 31, 9 of those are default. You've got a significant employer sector, and you've got your older complying super funds. In Australia, look at the numbers, 2002 to 2018. Our old corporate DBs, they're almost extinct now, 2,500 down to 22. The industry NFP, not-for-profits, 134 down to 38. The retail, not all bank-owned, but the majority in terms of assets are bank-owned, 254 down to 116. Self-managed, unique to Australia, nowhere else in the world. You're your own trustee. The numbers have grown from 250,000 to 600,000. You're your own trustee, you manage it, you administer it, you invest it in your own name. You make the decisions yourself. Assets is really interesting. Corporate obviously is flatlined. Look at the growth of the not-for-profit industry and the public sector. Public sector are DC in Australia, closed DC. That is your profit for member sector. it is growing at an extraordinary rate. Industry not-for-profit grew at 130% in assets over 6 years. Public sector not far behind. Retail and self-managed growing at a much lower rate, about 50 to 60%. And that differential is growing, and I'll come to why it's growing shortly. Returns and fees. I had a good look at the best 10 providers in New Zealand on a database. This is over 5 years. This is KiwiSaver, your best 10. And these are the different, there are other options, but these are your main options. These are the return over 5 years, your average, and then your range of fees that apply to each of the these investment options. That's your best 10. What I would observe is that it's only a relatively small number of KiwiSaver members who are in your best 10 funds. Only a relatively small number. I can't work out the precise number, but I've looked at the names of those providers, and they are not the dominant providers in the New Zealand system. They are not the dominant providers. Australia, the best 10 performing funds on return, I'll make a couple of comments about that. They're all profit for member. None of them are retail profit bank-owned funds. None of them. They're all $10 billion plus in size, and interestingly, the majority of members in the Australian system are in the 10 best funds. Only the majority, and I'll come back to the minority. The other interesting thing to observe is in Australia, the Balance My Super default is growth. It's not the New Zealand default balanced. So Australia's quite different from New Zealand and most other countries. Its balanced default is 60% equities. Australia, diversified Australia, global, a high proportion and growing proportion of infrastructure and alternatives, very little bonds and cash. That's very different from New Zealand and very different from most other countries, and I'll come back to that. The other interesting point is look at the fee range on these investment options in the best 10 in Australia. Look at the fee range compared to the fee range on the best 10 in New Zealand. There's a much broader spread of fee range on the best 10 in New Zealand, which I find quite fascinating. The other point is a 2% fee rather than 1% reduces final balance by 20% over 30 years. And bear in mind, most people are going to be in the system for 60 years. 40 years pre-retirement, 20 years post-retirement. So only 0.5% makes a very, very significant difference in outcomes. I mentioned in Australia multiple providers. The big blight on the Australian system is the number of multiple accounts and lost accounts. We're now starting to deal with this. You don't have this problem in New Zealand. So we've got, we did have 38 million accounts for about 12 or 13 million people in the workforce. This problem exists in Hong Kong, in Ireland, in the UK. We're now introducing a mandatory consolidation regime. New Zealand does not have this problem. And that's a good thing. It will remove some 340 million Australian dollars in duplicate admin fees, which is obviously a good thing. We've got auto consolidation up to $6,000, and that will, and 5 million accounts will be, and I stress this because this is a really good example of why you need default solutions in a mandatory DC system. The member won't do it. I expressed earlier my scepticism in a mandatory system of individuals being educated. Funds have been spending tens of millions of dollars over a long period of time trying to educate people to consolidate accounts. In a mandatory system, only a minority do it. That's a really important lesson, I think, to come out of Australia. We spent far too long in fixing that problem. Productivity Commission, the Hayne Royal Commission, at the same time you had the Productivity Commission. Out of the Productivity Commission, none of it really surprised me personally. The evidence if you read the evidence in the Productivity Commission, most of the fee data that they looked at already existed. It's on the public record. What the Productivity Commission did was crystallise and settle, I think, the debate about what the default investment option should be, who are the best providers in terms of long-term return, what the fee level should be, etc. The Productivity Commission have effectively settled that debate in Australia, which has been raging for the last 10 to 15 years. I've touched on multiple accounts. They identified the major structural flaw was multiple accounts. Well, that's been fixed. And also underperforming funds and excessive fees. The retail sector for profit, most of them were poor performing in terms of long-term return, and most of them were higher fee. In the industry, not-for-profit sector, profit for member, it identified some poor performing funds. Not all profit for member funds are performing well. Mainly smaller, under $10 billion funds. There are quite a number of smaller not-for-profits. Self-managed performance, the Productivity Commission was very critical of individuals investing under $1 million in assets in self-managed. It later revised that to $500,000. Didn't say why, and didn't recommend any changes in the self-managed sector. The majority of people in the self-managed sector have less than $1 million in assets. It's suboptimal, but nevertheless, that sector exists. Major recommendations from the Productivity Commission. I think there was some influence from New Zealand here. Best in show, we should only have 10 funds for all new members, and the individual chooses from those 10 funds, and if you don't choose, you're auto-allocated, look at this, for life. Productivity Commission saying, once you're in that one of those 10 funds, you're there for life. You're stapled, they use that term, you are stapled to that fund, and we know we can get away with that because it is a best-in-show fund. We'll see what happens, but there's no political support for that in Australia. None whatsoever, other than, really interestingly, one of the bank funds. One of the bank funds has broken ranks with its colleagues and said it wants the best-in-show system. They also recommended the exiting of underperforming funds. How they do that is going to be really interesting. It's going to be up to the regulators going forward off the Royal Commission. What will happen is this focus on trustee duty, in my view, APRA and ASIC will focus on what the trustees are doing. What's the design of the default fund? Is it optimal? Is it optimal? Is it in the best interest of the member? Is there fee gouging going on? What are the conflicts? Where are the fees going to? And that will, in my view, drive out the underperforming not-for-profit funds, the industry, public sector funds. But as I say, some of them are not performing well against their peers. It represents a real dilemma for the retail sector in Australia. You might have seen the banks are selling off, getting out of super investment in Australia. It's a real dilemma. In one sense, the banks can solve the problem by selling off their entities. The bigger problem is for those who are not bank-owned, and I'll name them, AMP and IOOF and others, they're all in the media in Australia. The bigger problem is their business model has to adjust to a best interest test. It can no longer deliver to shareholder and or advisor over the member, and that's a real challenge for the retail sector in Australia. Really big challenge. Multiple account consolidation I've touched on, and they recommended an inquiry into retirement incomes. As I say, no political parties announced, and obviously we've got an election, and my prediction is none will go anywhere near this short list of 10, but all these other things will happen via the activities of the regulator focusing on trustee duty and obligation. Just finish on one final point, segueing back to the Hayne Royal Commission. And I'm not over-egging this or overstating it. The Hayne Royal Commission didn't just look at banks, it looked at the superannuation sector. Profit for member sector, best interest, got a clean tick. You're doing well. Retail sector was trashed. and I'm not overstating it, it was trashed in the Royal Commission by a series of individual case studies which showed that some in the retail sector were simply not putting the interests of the member first. They were trashed. And the consequence is there's a significant shift now. Previously, people were passive. They were in a retail fund, whatever the fund was, they generally wouldn't move to a profit for member. Now there's a big shift in assets because the retail sector's been trashed. Its brand has been destroyed to varying degrees depending on the provider, and they're shifting over to the profit for member. And the profit for member sector, which has the better long-term return record, interestingly, these funds are now mega funds. They are now bigger by and large than the old retail bank funds, and they're globalising and they're advertising their own names. This didn't happen 10 years ago. These profit for member funds did not exist 30 years ago. They now have brand, which is positive, and they have good performance. So we're seeing a big, big shift in the Australian system as a consequence.
Nick, thank you so much.